My first experience with disaster management, or relief as we would call it in those days, was working with Ugandan refugees that were fleeing the regime of Idi Amin in Uganda. When I was asked to go and lead up and set up a program with the Ugandan refugees, my first question is, what's a refugee? In other words, I had absolutely no experience, no professional skilling to enable me to work with a community that was in very serious problems. And what I relied upon was my own creativity, some experience in other areas of work that, in a sense, gave me some good practical skills. But I certainly didn't have some of the assets that we currently have available to us today in terms of good systems, communications, training, and particular areas of professional development for work in relief and development contexts. So a very large change where we move from simply having good intentions to be able to go and do something, and that carried the day, as it were, through to today where we need to be much more professionalised. And yes, we still need to have those good intentions, but we need much more than just simply good intentions for our activities now. I think there are two reasons why we need to professionalise our relief operations and the way in which we as individuals operate within those activities. The first is that our donor communities expect a very high level of delivery and professional activity and understanding within our environment. So we need to get on board with those activities. And then perhaps the greater reason is that by professionalising and having better systems, we in fact can provide a better level and greater level of assistance to communities that are actually being affected. So in the case of World Vision, this translates to us being able to actually provide greater levels of assistance to children, particularly those in very difficult and vulnerable circumstances. I think some of the more important systemic changes that have needed to be in place relate to having established policies and standards and systems that enable us, in a sense, to have the discussions before we get into some of these pressurised, chaotic environments. In other words, we can establish ways of working, and we can even train ourselves in a preparedness type of environment, in readiness for the real event, as it were, so that we can be most effective, and that we're not having the discussions around some of the more elementary and foundational ways in which we operate, and that we can actually focus on the specific context and the complexities of that context in that particular environment. Our staff have needed to adjust and be supported in their development in these new and perhaps more complicated ways of working, so that we can deal with these particularly complex environments that we find ourselves addressing today, as compared to previously, where in a sense it was largely built upon good experience and good common sense. Today, it means that our staff are being equipped to actually understand and implement policies and standards, and be able to operate not just on their own, but operate within teams where they can deploy those in an integrated manner. Disaster response is but one element of disaster management. And while disaster response is high profile, is very visible, and attracts much of the attention, there is a number of other key components that go to make up disaster management, beginning with early warning type activities related to preparedness activities, that would pre-position supplies, for example, and have appropriate levels and numbers and type of staff ready to deploy to a disaster context. through to mitigation activities that would seek to at least reduce, if not eliminate, the impacts of disaster events that would be deemed to be in the future, potentially, in highly vulnerable environments. Then, of course, we've got response that actually do need to engage around life-saving activities and being able to provide the necessary elements of protection for communities that are impacted by a particular disaster event. Moving beyond response, though, we have recovery activities that are, in a sense, implemented after the stabilisation of communities, and the life-saving activities particularly have been addressed. And then, of course, development activities need to ultimately move that community more to a place where higher levels of resilience, vulnerability levels have been reduced. And so there's an important need to have transition type activities being implemented. If we take a look at the full spectrum, therefore, of disaster management, it's absolutely critical that all 6 of those components are actually in operation, not just emergency response. In disaster contexts where we see the full deployment, as it were, of the various components of disaster management are in fact very intentionally developed in all of our disaster responses today. So if we take an example such as the recent food crisis and drought in the Horn of Africa, we have a situation there where early warning activities and actual activities being implemented as a consequence of the early warning taking place within communities where World Vision is working. In other words, World Vision and those communities were identifying that there was actually a problem beginning to emerge in their particular context. And so they were able to actually start activities because of that early warning approach. However, as the disaster context evolved and developed to a more serious scale, pieces of activities such as mitigation, where food supplies were brought into a context to guard against or hedge against serious malnutrition amongst children in those communities, that actually prevented deaths. Had that mitigation type activity not been done, many more community members, particularly young children, would have lost their lives. As the disaster developed yet further, then of course there needed to be full-scale emergency response activities happening, and that happened at a very wide scale across countries such as Kenya and Somalia. But then of course, when those communities were stabilised in terms of their nutritional status, it was simply not good enough then just simply to cease operations and our organisation to move out of there. There needed to be follow-on activities, not only just to be able to have communities go back to a status of what they used to be, but in fact try to address issues that actually might increase their resilience to future events, and to be able to transition across in terms of longer-term development programming. So the full spectrum of those 6 dimensions of disaster management were actually at play in the Horn of Africa response.